Judith Silberfennik Kestenberg, my mother, was born in 1910 in Warsaw, Poland. Her father, an eccentric sort of fellow, decided one day that he would open a small orphanage. She and her mother used to go there and play with the children, and we speculated that from this perhaps grew her love of working with children. She studied medicine in Austria, perhaps getting a glimpse of Sigmund Freud once. In order to continue her work, she got a fellowship working with Paul Schindler in New York at Bellevue Hospital. In New York, she met Milton Kestenberg. He was also from Poland. He had arrived in 1939. They fell in love, married, and settled into their work. After World War II began, she began receiving letters from her mother, Salome, who had fled to Russian-occupied Poland. And in these letters, Salome was asking for food, was asking for some way to be helped, to be rescued. She heard also from her father, who was in Warsaw at the time. So she began desperately trying to find ways to bring them to the United States, and I have a whole series of her correspondences with the State Department and other agencies. The State Department wrote her, "We are only issuing visas now for non-preference applicants, chargeable to the Polish quota." In the case of her mother, Salome, the State Department wrote, "It was pleasant to hear that your mother has obtained the American visa. However, I have been assured that the Russians are allowing no one to leave Russian-occupied Poland." After the war, refugees tell her that of having seen her father in Auschwitz, and nothing more is heard from her mother. I was born at this time of mourning, and 10 years later my brother Howard was born. Even the birth of children never washes away the pain. Judith's work was focused in two main fields: the study of children as they develop and cope with everyday stresses of life, and the study of children who were traumatized by Holocaust experiences. As a child psychoanalyst, Judith at times was confronted with pre-verbal children. She realized that since it was impossible to interview them, another method was needed to delve inside their psyches. She hoped that the mystery of infants would be revealed in movement. But what qualities of movement should she describe? What would reveal psychological and developmental issues of an infant? Drawing on movement specialists, she and the Sands Point study group correlated movement qualities to Anna Freud's psychodynamic portrait, and thus was born the Kestenberg movement profile.
Walked into her classroom, which was her living room, dining room, and we all sat around a table, and I think that first meeting we all had prepared each in our own way with developmental and psychodynamic literature in our minds and thinking about whether we knew enough to take on these studies. And within minutes, Judith had us on the floor, on our bellies, feeling what it might be like to be a 4-month-old, asking us to try rolling over, asking which body parts were involved in the rolling over. And this was what learning with Judith was about. A great deal of reading, a great deal of theory, a great deal of integration, but always coming back to the body and what it was doing in the process.
In 1972, Judith and Arnhild Bülte opened the Center for Parents and Children. Its goal was the prevention of developmental and stress-related problems. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and children up to 5 years of age participated. Even before the birth of their child, sometimes pregnant mothers and fathers attended. She believed that how a baby is held may have a long-lasting impact into the next generation.
If the parent is particularly stressed, which aspects of the parent's movement are the ones that are most likely to communicate the stress? Which patterns of the child are most likely to embody the stress that's been transmitted?
Because she was interested in how parents transmit the impact of trauma they've suffered onto their children, she began to look at children of survivors of the Holocaust.
roughly the end of the 60s or the beginning of the 70s, nobody thought that survivors or their children are good subjects for psychoanalysis. They seem too disturbed and their problems too severe.
In 1971, Judith Kestenberg sent out a questionnaire to psychoanalytic colleagues all over the world whether indeed they had any second generation of Holocaust survivors in treatment. And indeed, quite a few did, and they said, but what does that have to do with the treatment? So that you can see the pervasiveness of how psychoanalysts did not understand that the genocide and racism has such an impact not only on the first generation, but also on the subsequent generations. The first generation cannot do all the mourning of all the losses, that it will take many generations to mourn what has happened.
So Judith had the idea of organizing a special study group to study the effect of the Holocaust on the second generation.
The work of the study group culminated in the book The Generations of the Holocaust. By the early 1980s, Holocaust survivors began to form groups and hold conferences, but the focus was on adult survivors. It was often believed that children were resilient. Children did not really understand or remember, and thus were not affected by the trauma. Judith had a quite different view of children.
She was the first person ever, or at all, to take notice of children who suffered the agonies for 40 years in silence of their experiences and never had a place for expression, and she helped them along, and it was an amazing thing.
In 1984, that there was a American gathering of Holocaust survivors, and Judith Kestenberg had decided to have a booth to try to get Holocaust child survivors to be interviewed for the International Study of Organized Persecution of Children.
And I did my interview, and she kind of coaxed me to come. I didn't want to. I was really in denial. I didn't want to talk about my past, although everyone knew my past. And it was a long, long interview because I had 5 or 6 years of war and 5 or 6 years of being in hiding and then living in the Warsaw Ghetto, and she was very interested.
It was just like relieving things that were probably inside me, but here I was talking to somebody who understood my feelings and understood what I'm telling. It was not just like talking to a stranger.
You basically one spills one's guts out in the interview. What happened in the past, and in the persecution and the torture, and you know, I was lined up to be shot and so on. It's a lot of to talk, right? So the interview is like, what should I say, Day of Atonement. You just come out with the whole thing and you talk. But it's a good feeling that you talk to somebody who has listened, and it's trustful. And it's the trust that makes a difference.
And they chased me from the Polish side to the Ukrainian side. Then the Ukrainians were shooting at us. And it was just a few short time before we were liberated. They still went after us. They killed everyone they could. So we had very emotional, everybody has their own emotional feelings and different degrees of pain and suffering. I saw my mother and brothers all killed in front of my eyes.
The children do not believe in their own death because it's hard to understand, why do other people want to kill us? What did we do?
The Holocaust, for example, undermined the belief of the child in the strength of their parents. For a child suddenly to realize that his mother is an enemy of the state, or to to feel that they are persecuted. How the child grasps the situation is distinguished from how an adult understands the situation.
What was extraordinary about the interviews was that they were rather analytically oriented. All the interviews were confidential, and nobody would be able to identify the child survivor. What this did was enable each child survivor to speak freely about aspects of his or her family's background and his or her experience during the war, knowing full well that this would be used for research, but that no one in the family would find out